The Siren's Call. Chapter 4. By the time July pulled into the parking lot of the Velvet Bean, dusk had started to settle over the city. It had been 2 weeks, but he couldn't get Cinnamon out of his mind. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, taking in the building. Something about it felt off. The coffee shop was housed in a narrow, weathered brownstone with black painted trim. A dim, flickering neon sign that read "The Velvet Bean" buzzed faintly in the window, casting an eerie glow on the sidewalk. Cobweb decorations sprawled across the corners of the doorframe, complete with plastic spiders that seemed almost too lifelike. A skeleton leaned against the wall near the entrance, its bony hand clutching a coffee cup, while carved pumpkins with grotesque faces lined the steps. It wasn't the kind of place July would have chosen. He frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter as a chill ran down his spine. Maybe it was the Halloween decorations, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. The air felt heavy, like a warning he couldn't ignore. "This isn't my scene," he muttered to himself, glancing at the clock on his dashboard. He was a half-hour early. Too early to go in without looking overeager, but also too early to leave without questioning why he was here in the first place. For a moment, he considered praying, but the thought felt strange, almost hypocritical. How could he ask God for guidance about meeting a woman he already knew he shouldn't be pursuing? His hand hovered over the steering wheel, hesitant. "Lord," he started, but the words caught in his throat. What could he even say? That he was knowingly walking into a situation that didn't feel right? That he couldn't stop himself from wanting to see her, even when everything in his spirit told him to turn around? He sighed deeply, leaning back in his seat. "It's just coffee," he reasoned, though the unease in his chest didn't let up. He stared at the darkened windows of the shop, the faint outlines of patrons moving inside, and debated his next move. A voice in his mind, Trevor's voice, or maybe his own conscience, whispered, "You don't have to go in there." Another smooth and tantalizing voice like Cinnamon's replied, "What's the harm? It's just a conversation." The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, July shook his head, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out of the car. The sound of his shoes hitting the pavement echoed in the stillness, each step feeling heavier than the last as he approached the door. The closer he got, the more the decorations seemed to take on a life of their own. The skeleton's grin seemed wider now, almost mocking him, and the jack-o'-lantern's carved eyes glowed faintly, as if watching his every move. July hesitated at the bottom of the steps, his hand hovering near the railing. His unease wasn't just about the decorations or the dark ambiance of the building. It was something deeper, an unshakable feeling that he was walking into a trap. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. This is ridiculous, he thought. It's just a coffee shop, just a girl, just a conversation. But as he reached for the door handle, he couldn't help but feel like he was crossing a threshold he wouldn't be able to uncross. As July reached for the door, a soft, almost hypnotic voice whispered near his ear. "I'm glad you came, July," Cinnamon said, her words slipping into his mind like silk. He froze, his hand still on the knob, and turned slightly. She was behind him, impossibly close, her presence sudden and unannounced. Where did she come from? The question flickered in his mind, but evaporated as quickly as it arrived. Her perfume wrapped around him, warm, sweet, and intoxicating, like honey and spices on a summer breeze. Before he could react, she placed her hand over his, gently guiding him to turn the knob. Her touch was electric, and her voice, smooth, rich, and sinful, like butter melting over hot corn on the cob, kept him rooted in place. The door creaked open and Cinnamon slid past him, her hand still gripping his as she led him inside. She moved with an effortless grace, her hips swaying in rhythm with the eerie, classical music that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the dimly lit pub. July followed her, his legs moving without thought, his mind struggling to keep up with the sensations overwhelming him. The first thing he noticed was the light. An orange glow bathed the room, casting flickering shadows that danced unnervingly across the walls. The decorations that had seemed playful outside now morphed into something darker, almost sinister. The faces carved into the pumpkins looked grotesque, their jagged grins sneering at him. The walls seemed alive, covered in murals of horrific expressions, wide, unblinking eyes and distorted mouths that seemed to stretch toward him. But July could barely focus on them. His attention was fixed on Cinnamon, who glided effortlessly through the space, her fingers never leaving his. Her hair shimmered under the dim light, and the scent of her perfume grew stronger, pulling him further into her orbit. The music grew louder, its haunting melody wrapping around him like a spell. Each note seemed to vibrate in his chest, drowning out the uneasy whisper of his conscience. The air was thick with an aroma he couldn't quite place, exotic, sweet, and earthy, as if the room itself was alive with temptation. As they approached the back of the pub, Cinnamon let go of his hand briefly, allowing her hair to tumble down her shoulders in a cascade of reddish-brown waves. She turned to him with a slow, deliberate smile, her eyes shimmering like the surface of a stormy sea. "Have a seat," she said, her voice a command disguised as an invitation.